Well, good evening, everyone, and I'm going to get us started with some announcements, and then I'll continue to admit people as we start out. But I'm happy that we have some folks with us now. So for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the American Civil War Museum based in Richmond, Virginia. But we do have a satellite location out in Appomattox, Virginia. And we also operate the White House of the Confederacy here in Richmond. So we've got 3 different sites and a very active museum. And I'm here to tell you about a few programs that we have coming up. And these are going to be, our next book talk is actually going to be an in-person event that is going to take place in Richmond on August 14th and in Appomattox on August 20th. So 2 different weekends, but we will have with us Ken Rutherford, and he'll be talking about America's buried history, landmines in the Civil War. So, and I just had somebody say they got a link that says invalid login. So I may try to send out another email here in a minute, but mark your calendars for that in-person program. And then just quickly here, our next virtual book talk will be in about a month on September 1st. It'll be at 6:30, so another Thursday evening, and we'll have with us Jeffrey Wirt. He is speaking on his newest book, The Heart of Hell, The Soldier's Struggle for Spotsylvania's Bloody Angle. So again, take note of that and put that on your calendar. Now for tonight, I am very pleased to have with us Dr. Angela Esco Elder. She is an associate professor of history at Converse University, where she teaches a variety of American history courses, including those in her specialty area, the Civil War and women's history. And after graduating from the University of Georgia with a PhD in history, she became the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, I'll get it out, postdoctoral fellow at Virginia Tech. Her dissertation explored the experience of Confederate widowhood and won the Southern Historical Association's C. Vann Woodward Dissertation Prize and also the St. George Tucker Society's Melvin E. Bradford Dissertation Prize in 2017. And Dr. Elder has also published chapters in books, as well as encyclopedia articles and book reviews. So we are pleased to have her here tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the screen over to our guest author and let her talk about her book.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for the persistence of all of you to navigate through broken links in a busy time of year. And I am excited to talk about my new book and then also leave plenty of time for questions and conversations afterwards. So I have some slides for us. So I'm going to share my screen. Oops. And hopefully we will get this going. Okay, can y'all see those? I see some nods. All right, fantastic. Okay, so my book, Love and Duty, like most authors, I have a lot I could say about it. Authors are not really known for being short or brief. And so what I've done tonight is try to zoom in on a few talking points to guide us and make sure that I don't go too far over. So for tonight, I'm going to start with why this project, why this book. I know I always love hearing how authors fell into their various topics. There's a lot of different things you can write about when it comes to the American Civil War. So I'll share why I fell into this topic. Then I'll talk about the argument, the so what, why does this matter, why should we care point that my students always need hit particularly hard. So I'll touch on that tonight. Third, why this title? I think it's an interesting story. It comes from a powerful poem, and it took me a while to get to this particular title. And then I'll end talking about one of the chapters of this book. This was a chapter that I researched and added after the dissertation, and kind of grumbled my way through, and then it ended up being one of my favorite chapters, as it often goes. So I will end our time talking about that. And then, like I said, hopefully only go for about 30-ish minutes or so. So we have lots of time so we can talk about it all. All right. So, okay, why this project? I fell into this when I was still in graduate school. I was in a class with Dr. John Insco, a community studies class at the University of Georgia. And I knew that I wanted to do something on Civil War history. I wanted to do something on gender history, but beyond that, I had absolutely no idea. And so I did what many graduate students do. You go and you sit down in the archives and you read. And I read letters and diaries, hoping that something would spark, that something would catch my interest. And it was really special. If you've never been to an archive, I highly recommend it. Obviously, you're all history enthusiasts to be spending your time here on a Thursday evening. Anybody can go in a university or a college. Sometimes they're in state libraries. And you get to hold these slips of paper, 150, 160 years old, and read these powerful stories that are just there and waiting. And so one of the boxes that I stumbled in was the story of Will and Rosa Deloney. And you can see Will on your screen here pictured with the very large beard. The folder started with some biographical information. A map showed me that their house had been in downtown Athens, Georgia. It's now a parking lot today. A marriage certificate informs me that they had had a summer wedding in 1854, and birth certificates revealed that when the Civil War broke out, Rosa had 3 children under the age of 4. So busy, lots going on with this family. And then the letters begin, this quiet conversation of paper and ink going back and forth between Will and between Rosa. And on his 9th wedding anniversary, Will found himself in Gordonsville, Virginia, miles from home, with this quote, as you can see here, "A longing for home that makes my army life almost insupportable." And what Rosa didn't realize, and what I didn't realize 150 plus years later, was that I was holding his very last letter. And so I flipped the page in this folder, and the next thing was this smaller slip of paper, a telegram to a neighbor with a newspaper excerpt and instructions, quote, "On account of her condition, break the news to Mrs. Deloney as best you can." And so that's the second image on your slide here. And so long story short, Will had received a mortal wound in his left thigh. He was captured. He died in a Union hospital. And Rosa was 8 months pregnant with her 4th child. And the thing that struck me was that there was so much more in this box, right? This story didn't end with that slip of paper. And so I kept reading, and I discovered that Rosa had the baby, a girl, in November of 1863. And then after that, she turned her attention to bringing her husband's body home. She knew that he had been buried north of Washington, D.C., but she wanted his remains in Georgia. She wanted him in the family cemetery. She wanted to have a place where she could visit and mourn. And so keep reading. And then I discovered that in July of 1866, Rosa and Will's final daughter, who was then a toddler, that little girl, dies of whooping cough. 2 months later, Rosa was successful in getting Will's body returned, and he is buried beside this tiny grave. In 1863, Will couldn't contain his excitement as he planned to come home, to be there for the birth of his child, to be there for the holidays. And now he lays beside her in the Oconee Hill Cemetery in Athens. And so obviously, if Rosa could have planned this, if Will could have planned this would not have been the chain of events that they wanted. But for Rosa, in the midst of a very uncertain future, at least she knew that one thing was certain: her husband was home right next to her child, this child that he had never even met. And so that's what started this project for me. I was struck by this idea that you could walk through this cemetery and you would have no idea of this story, right? You would just see a father buried beside a child and think, oh, that's sad. But the fact that there are so many of those stories that I had not read before, heard of before, even thought of before is what started me down this research. And so historians estimate that approximately 750,000 men died in the American Civil War. We know that this is America's bloodiest war. We know that the number of men who died in this war is higher than many other wars combined. But we don't often think about how it leaves widows first by the hundreds, then by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. And some of them are as young as 16, 17, 18 years old. They get married in this patriotic rush to the altar. And if approximately 28% of soldiers were married, which is where we have settled, it's really hard to get those exact numbers. We're looking at roughly 200,000 women who are widowed by this war. And oops, way too far. Hold on, back to our slide here. Okay, and so death is something that weighs heavily on Americans in this time, right? As families are mourning a husband, a brother, a son, a cousin. And for many communities, mourning attire, what people are wearing, is of the utmost importance. And so it's almost as if there's this visible black shadow that's been cast across these communities. Judith McGuire from Virginia wrote, quote, "It is melancholy to see how many wear mourning." Or if you look at this newspaper account, right, kind of zooming in to the middle here, "The whole nation is a vast house of mourning. Christmas, once so merry and joyous, now finds the widow and her little ones clustered together in grief. Carnage, blood, devilish hate, all the horrors of hell seem to rise uppermost and turn the land into a vast human slaughter pen." And so those were the stories that brought me into this project. And then I became especially fascinated by this question of what was the war like in particular for Confederate widows, right? Women who endure fighting in their home states, in their backyards in many cases, and then to also take it a step further and think about what is it like for widows who not only lose a husband in this war, but then also lost the war too. Which leads us into the second part. What does this book argue? Why does this all matter? So as you can see on your slide, Love and Duty argues that the emotional expressions of widows carry new political meaning amid the crisis of war and the battle to establish the Confederacy's legitimacy. So to break that down a little bit, if you have done a lot of reading in the Civil War, you are familiar that there are a lot of strong scholars in the field who laid a foundation for me to build this study on. People like Drew Gilpin Faust, right? This Republic of Suffering, Diane Miller Somerville, Anya Jabour, Laura Edwards, Stephanie McCurry. There's a lot of stuff out there, fantastic scholars who helped me to really zoom in and build on their work in my focus on widows. So when the Civil War begins, people in the 19th century expect death to happen in a very particular way. It's this concept historians call the good death, right? A person is supposed to die at the end of a very long and fulfilling life. Ideally, they will die at home, not in a hospital, right? They'll be surrounded by family. It will be peaceful. They have an opportunity to share their last words. There's often a lot of religion that gets tied into this death experience. That is a good death. That is what 19th century Americans expect. As you can imagine, the Civil War doesn't exactly bring about good deaths. Deaths are sudden. They are far from home. They're taking people who are 18, 19, 20 years old. And in some cases, families are at the mercy of strangers to even learn that the death had occurred, right? There's not much of anything that families can control in this experience. So if families couldn't control the death and they're losing and shattering this whole good death ideal that's so important, they turn to what they can control, what is within their scope, and that's mourning. And so many people try to focus on mourning and focus on mourning etiquette, this etiquette that began before the Civil War, and then build upon it. So For example, some of the rules that most 19th century white Americans followed. Number one, widows are supposed to mourn for 2.5 years. So for 2.5 years, they are in this grieving experience. Now that's for a widow. For a husband who loses his wife, it's a 3-month mourning period. That's what's considered standard at the time, to give you some insight into the gender dynamics. But for a widow, it's 2.5 years. As I briefly mentioned, widows should wear mourning, the idea being that their exterior should reflect their interior emotions. And so Confederate communities expected widows to wear black dresses, black veils, and then progress into lavenders and grays over the course of that 2.5-year mourning period. And even if they couldn't afford mourning clothing, many women would dye the clothes that they had black in order to meet this expectation. For 2.5 years, a widow should not remarry. A soldier is supposed to be irreplaceable. No flirting, no dancing, no courting. So Gone with the Wind's treasured Scarlett O'Hara, not a good widow by the standards of the 19th century. Oops, not yet. Yes, okay, there we go. And then if they have children like Rosa, they're supposed to care for those children. These are the children of their husbands, so they're especially important. And at a time when a lot of widows are younger than they've ever been before in such great numbers, a lot of them are pregnant at the time that their husbands pass away. Widows are supposed to turn to God to find comfort in a reunion in heaven, to find strength in the Bible, in the church. And a lot of soldiers will sign their letters even before they pass away, "Meet me in heaven," in anticipation of this possibility. And then finally, for the Confederacy in particular, it becomes extremely important that widows devote themselves to the Confederacy, that the Confederacy can fill this role almost as a husband. If a widow can lose her husband to this cause and still support the cause that killed him, that is a really powerful message. That is a really powerful endorsement, political endorsement for the Confederacy. But if a widow is like, no, enough is enough, send home my father, send home my brother, send home my male cousins, that's a really powerful indictment that says something against the Confederacy, suggesting that it's a political project that isn't worth it. And so what I found in my research is that letters and speeches and government officials, they all glorify the widow who mourns her husband well, who dedicates herself to the Confederacy. And she, in turn, is able to get things that she wants and that she needs from her community as a result of her behavior. And so, as this slide here says, as soldiers' widows, Confederate women could leverage the label and their particular relationship with the Confederate administration in attempts to receive support, recognition, or political influence. So they would write letters, for example, to government officials and emphasize the fact that they are Confederate widows, and therefore whoever they're writing to owes them something, should provide them something. And some widows are going to play this part perfectly. They are going to do all of the things that their community hopes that they will do and further their own political and personal agendas. But I also found a lot of widows who don't, who aren't able, who are too heartbroken, who are too traumatized, who are too poor. Some of them who have husbands that really weren't great husbands to begin with. And so while not quite a relief, maybe kind of a relief, depending on the situation that they are in. And so I'll talk about this a little more when I zoom in on chapter 6. There's a lot of complexity that's happening here, but essentially that is the argument in a nutshell. And then for my title, so originally when I wrote this, when the early version of this project as a dissertation, I titled Married to the Confederacy. And I loved it because I had these paired chapters that followed vows to have and to hold till death do us part, et cetera, et cetera. But then when I was doing additional research for the book, it just didn't quite fit. And I wasn't sure how exactly to frame and package this project. And the press, UNC Press, who is wonderful, who I published this with, my editors, we went back and forth until finally I discovered this poem, which I absolutely love. It might be small depending on the screen that you're looking at right now. It's in the front of the book too. The whole thing is powerful, but it's this poem that's written by a soldier's wife that's published immediately after the Civil War. And it says, their love, the true, the brave, the beautiful, the strong, wrestles with duty, gaunt and stern, wrestles and struggles long. And so I loved this idea of love and duty at war with one another, right? That struggle that we still see with us today in some cases. He falls no more to meet his giant, he falls no more again, his giant foe to meet, bleeding at every opening vein, love falls at duty's feet. And so there is the image, right? So this is the ideal, this gruesome, horrible, bloody image of love is the thing that ultimately has to fall. And then on the second part of the image here, it talks about, while she, the tried, the true, the loving wife of years, chokes down the rising agony, drives back the starting tears. I yield thee up, she cries, in the country's cause to fight. Strike for our own, our children's home, and God defend the right? So again, right here, this loving wife who's supposed to drive back the tears and give up her spouse. And again, I think that's particularly powerful in this situation where you give up to this cause and then the war is lost. So how do you wrestle with that afterwards? Okay. I got off my notes there. All right. So title, there's our title. Let's dig into some of the specifics. All right. So here's all the chapters. Here's all the book. When I envisioned this book, I envisioned it as a book that ended in 1865. So I would go to all of these different archives. I would read letters and diaries from widows themselves, but also just big family collections talking about widows and communities. And it wasn't until after I'd done all of that work that I was struck with this question, okay, but what happens afterwards, right? What role do women play in the Ladies Memorial Association or in the United Daughters of the Confederacy? How do they fit into the monuments that are being put up after the Civil War? What happens next? And I turned to newspapers for a lot of that research. And so you can see the structure of this book, starting in the antebellum South to kind of give us a baseline of what marriage looked like and what death looked like, kind of going into the Civil War, talking a lot about those quick marriages that happens, those that rush to the altar, and then kind of going from there and ending with a little bit on Reconstruction. And there's definitely a lot more work that can be done there, but that's part of what I will share with you today. I think one of the great values, at least for me, and why I love being a historian, is these stories and quotes that you read and they stick with you. And so this was one of them for me. This is from somebody in Charleston, South Carolina, who says, one looks at a man so differently when you think he may be killed tomorrow. Men whom up to this time I thought dull and commonplace seemed charming. And so wow, right? I mean, this rush to this altar, it makes everything more complicated when you think about all of these young widows who don't necessarily know their husbands, all of these pregnant widows. And it reminds me of people, to pull another Virginia example for us today, like Hetty Carey, right? She gets married. She is a belle of the Confederacy. She is a wife for 3 weeks, and then she finds herself in the same church, walking down the same aisle, surrounded by the same guests of her wedding, but at a funeral. She is a wife for 3 weeks, but then she spends 15 years as a widow. And so what are those 15 years like, right? What is it like for these kinds of women after the Civil War? So, all right. What evidence have we that the cause has died out? But when we see widows wail or hear an orphan cry, I feel then the cause has indeed died out. If you let one of them wail, you may as well say the cause is dead. It shall be your cost. General Henry A. Wise, January of 1867. Newspapers across the country picked up this speech given at a church in Richmond, printed under the title, Relief for the Widows of Confederates. They declared the cause of the South not lost. It had been nearly 2 years since the end, the final shots of the war, but Wise calls for action. But this action is perhaps not what we would expect. He's not calling for weapons. He's not calling for eulogies. He's not calling for monuments. In fact, leave the noble memorials you have begun, which are only vanity. The Confederate dead all sleep well, thank God. Instead, he spends the majority of the speech calling for support for Confederate widows. He believed this is what deceased soldiers would want above all else. While soldiers lay in graves, their wives were very much alive and very much suffering. As you can see here, we must provide an asylum for both widows and orphans. Orphans is an interesting term within the 19th century. We perhaps all think of Lincoln talking about caring for the widow and the orphan, thinking about biblical references too. In the 19th century, a child would be called an orphan even if his mother was still alive. So every time we see orphans, in this case, it's referring to the children of widows whose mothers are still there, but because they've lost their father, in their community's eyes and in the community's language, they get this label of orphan. They haven't lost both of their parents in almost every case. And so in this final chapter, I look at how widows participate in the reconstruction of the nation and the parts that they play, or in some cases, don't play in this project. And so likely you can all think of elite widows who play a starring role, right? There are some very wealthy officers' wives who will travel the country, who will wear black, who will stand up on the stages of veterans reunions, and who will be widows of the Confederacy. And I talk about those widows in my book. But there are also some widows, as I've hinted at, as I've said, that are too busy, too tired, too poor, too emotionally spent, who decide not to participate. And in fact, most widows seem to fall into this second category. And in some ways, they have nothing to prove, right? A Confederate widow, by definition, has already sacrificed to the cause. Intact families, families who have their husbands at home with them, that argument could be made that they hadn't sacrificed quite as much, right? Widows already have a cultural standing that some women in the community do not. And so big picture here, white women don't seamlessly work together to create a lost cause ideology. And it suggests that perhaps those that the war hurts the most have the least left to give back to that war. So let's go through some stories here, some examples. Okay. So, for many widows of the Confederacy, not surprising, life continued to be extremely difficult after the Civil War. So here is an example out of Georgia in 1867, published in a Georgia newspaper talking about 30 Confederate widows in Alabama, because even then Georgia liked to poke holes at other states around them. And here it says the widows had published a card in the newspapers to make their case known, for they could quote, get no work with which to support themselves and their helpless children. In other words, they're appealing to the community to help because they can't find anyone to hire them. They can't find anyone to give them a job. They can't find anyone to financially support them. And so this Georgia newspaper says, this certainly is a piteous appeal. These women are the widows of the Confederate soldiers who perished in battle or died from diseases in camp. In other words, all widows deserve sympathy, but war widows in particular, they must be supported, right? They are owed something for their sacrifice. And so this author hoped the citizens of Montgomery would not disregard the cry of distress, so full of agony, literally the wail of the widow and the orphan. And yet, while widows struggled with these kinds of financial strains and emotional wounds after the war, as we know, stone monuments are rising up across the Confederacy. And some people, even in that moment, consider this to be absolute foolishness, right? So here you can see a sensible Virginian suggests that marble monuments to the Confederate dead will not feed starving widows and orphans in a North Carolina newspaper. Another author from South Carolina agrees here. Better indeed than any eulogy, better than any costly monument, better than any starry pointing pyramid is the home. And in this case, they're talking about a home that is being built for widows to provide food, shelter, clothing, in some cases, physical support as well. And then again, in Virginia, yet another example. This is from a really, really long newspaper article. It's talking about a letter that they received from an accomplished widow of a gallant officer. In other words, trying to suggest that even widows of officers are struggling to have both food and clothing, who says, and yet since his death, his widow and children had been reduced to such terrible straits that the widow was forced to appeal to us for assistance. We do not mention this as an isolated case, and focuses on the famine and all of the struggles that Confederate widows are facing. And so, like previous articles, here our attention is shifting away from this project of honoring the dead, right? This idea that honoring and decorating the graves of the dead will continue to happen. But as one article says, quote, "The noblest tribute we can pay to the memory of a dead soldier is to take care of those desolate loved ones. Financially caring for the living is the best way to honor the dead, not placing flowers on the graves." And I found this argument again and again and again, and I was struck by it. It was not something that I was familiar with before I dug into this research. And so it's not just people within the community. It also has a really strong religious component to it as well, as you can see here from Reverend Charles Wallace Howard, who argues very extensive arguments against memorialization efforts. He writes, "When our poor soldiers enlisted, we told them if they fell, the survivors would take care of their families. It was a promise carrying with it the sanctity of an oath. Have we kept it? Do we remember that widows of these hundreds of brave men now suffering from want of common necessities of life?" Howard believes that the communities had not remembered these widows. They had failed to uphold the promises made to Confederate soldiers. And so he turns to the actions that are happening around him. And he writes, quote, "Inscriptions on coin and monumental marble have sometimes a great value. We have erected monuments to the Confederate dead, a noble sentiment. The dead can wait. They rest coldly in the grave. The grave will become no colder. But the living," he argued, right, the living widows of these men, they couldn't wait. And therefore, he believes that money should be given. In his case, he's fundraising for a home for widows in Charleston. And that's more important for him than the memorialization efforts. And so it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. So big picture here, when I'm looking at all of this research and all of these stories together, the things that I was struck by the most is this idea that when we really look at white Confederate widows, it changes the way that we think of the Civil War, or at least it did for me. Because even though they share a gender, even though they share a label, these women didn't wound in the same way, right? They don't have the same strengths and weaknesses. And when we look deeply at this, we see all of the cracks and all of those differences when put under stress. Something which we can talk more about in the question and answer time if there's interest. Something that I was fascinated by was the relationship between mothers-in-law and widows, which, as you can imagine, depending on how long the wife then widow had been in the family, really affected that relationship, right? So if a woman had married a decade before the Civil War and then became a widow, she had established her household. But for some of these widows who are 18 or 19, who are pregnant and then lose their husbands, there's a lot of conflict between the mother-in-law, who very much sees that child as someone who she wants to care for, as the legacy of her late son. And sometimes there was some tension with the new wife. So anyway, big picture, looking at this changes the way that we see the household. And then secondly, for me, this idea that emotions mattered. For Confederate widows, the political and the personal and the personal and the political, right? It's so messy, and it leaves a lasting impression on both Confederate officials and on widows' communities. They aren't just widows, they are war widows. Because of that, they have this special status in their communities, in their societies. When I start my introduction in the book, I start with Jefferson Davis. And when he writes his history of the Confederate government after the Civil War, I found it striking that he doesn't dedicate this book or this history, he doesn't dedicate it to the veterans who fought. He doesn't dedicate it to the soldiers who died, but instead he dedicates it to the women who mourned. And I think that's worth noting. So, oh, good. I'm doing good on time. Okay, a couple of things before I stop sharing my screen. First of all, if you are interested in the book, UNC Press is having a fantastic sale right now on this book, on all of its books. And if you order a certain amount, you get free shipping. So that code, which you can see there, 01D8H40, and it's also all over their website. If you go to their website, you get 40% off. I stocked up on a bunch of my colleagues' books that are coming out. So it's definitely a great sale that you may want to take advantage of. And we're going to have about 20 minutes or so for question or conversations. But if we don't get to you, or if you do think of something afterwards, if you search my name, Angela Esco Elder, it should all come up. But I teach at Converse University. There is my email down there. I am on Twitter, though I am not very active at all. And that's my contact info. So I think that was it. Yes, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everything. And okay, thank you all.
Very, very interesting stuff there. I love anything that's associated with death and mourning. So I truly enjoyed your talk. And let me see if we've got any questions. Anyone out there with questions? Was there friction between the monument builders and the widows? And if you could talk a little bit about that.
So most of my research with that was in newspapers. So I didn't find any, for example, letters of widows and monument builders directly fighting with one another. What I found more striking is when I would look through, for example, the rolls of people who were participating in the Ladies Memorial Association, was that most of them weren't widows. So in other words, it was the absence, that this is being led by women who have their entire family home, and that women who I thought would be involved or maybe seek out the comfort of something dedicated to mourning are not there, and they are not present. Most of the direct tension that I saw was with a lot of ministers and pastors and religious leaders in the community who are trying to build these homes for the financial support, for the physical support of widows, and are very frustrated that they can't seem to get the money that they need to feed widows. And yet, they can walk down the street and see this new monument being built. So there's friction in the community there. I think there's a lot more stories there to be told for sure.
Yeah, there probably is. That would be an interesting aspect to delve into, and not something I've ever really thought about. And Wanda has a question. She said, so if they had to mourn for 2.5 years, what if a widow found another person that she wanted to marry? Would she have to wait 2.5 years before she could marry? Yeah, I think that's where it's going. So
that is a great question, and one of my favorite things to talk about, right? So we think about Scarlett from Gone with the Wind, and we think, oh, she's such a stereotype. But I did find some real life Scarletts, right? So there are, oh gosh, where do I even start? So there's one woman who she is courting various men while she's still in this 2.5-year mourning period. And she writes in the letters reminding her suitors that they need to disguise their handwriting, that their handwriting on the cover of these envelopes that she's receiving must look feminine. And she doesn't want anyone to know that she is engaging in these correspondences with men. Some women do remarry during that 2.5-year mourning period. One of my favorites is Fanny Hargrave from Georgia, and her husband passes away, and she is a character. She's very wealthy. She's from a large family. She literally is strapping gold around her waist underneath all of her dresses and petticoats and things. Anyway, she remarries her late husband's cousin, and she is still supposed to be in mourning. People write to her that they can't believe that this has happened. One cousin says they're very disappointed in her, that she is remarried, and she says, basically, stop fussing at me. I didn't realize it would come off so soon. But again, she's really wealthy, so she has more flexibility to be able to do something like that. But what I found was fascinating in this correspondence is I know that she's remarried, and I'm still reading through all of these letters, and I'm finding letters from people consoling her in her mourning, even though she's already remarried, but they don't realize she's already remarried. Talking about, one of them is from a neighbor who was with her husband when he was killed, and talking about the blood on the floor, that they've been scrubbing the floor and they still can't get the blood to come off the floor, and how traumatized she is by this. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, what would it have been like for her to read this letter and know that she's already remarried? I'm guessing still missing her late husband. She's also a complicated person because she was pregnant with her late husband's child, but then the child died in infancy. So kind of that double grief. and she had named that child after her late husband, which is what a lot of widows did. There's another widow, Tibby Stevens in Florida. She never remarries. She's one of the ones who grieves for the rest of her life. She's so absolutely heartbroken by the loss of her husband. And her husband's name was Winston. And so she names the little boy she was pregnant with. Within 1 week, she loses her husband. Her mother also passes away, and then the baby is born prematurely. But the baby survives into adulthood. It's a little boy. She names him Winston, but she can't bring herself to call him that. She calls him Winnie as a nickname. And one of her aunts writes the widow and says, don't call him Winnie. That's a girl's name. That's an ugly name. Call him after the man, the gallant hero for which he has been named. But she doesn't, right? She can't bring herself to that. She has a very complex mourning journey where she constantly immerses herself in grief. She looks through old scrapbooks. She reads old journals, and she keeps a journal well into her 70s or 80s. And she, this is the 35th anniversary of my marriage. This is the 47th anniversary of my husband's death. She's just like in this cycle. So there's two kind of extremes: the woman who mourns forever, never remarries, and then there certainly are the examples of those that do. From what I can tell, if they have enough wealth when they're remarrying, they get kind of dings on their reputation, but it doesn't seem too lasting. It's kind of catty or behind the scenes or things in diaries about how immature the widow is or that sort of thing. There is also some sympathy for widows who are extremely poor, who seem to remarry within that 2.5-year mourning period out of necessity. It seems like there's a little more community support. But for the widows who fall in the middle, who are not extremely poor, who could have mourned for 2.5 years, and not extremely wealthy so that they can get respect, those are the ones who fall into the biggest gray area of kind of slights in the community.
That is fascinating. It kind of makes sense though, but yeah. So Clark has a question. He said, A.P. Hill's widow, Kitty Morgan Hill McClung, wanted nothing to do with carrying on a lost war. This also in light of her brother, John Hunt Morgan, and also related to Basil Duke, which I didn't realize all those connections. So I'm finding that fascinating, Clark. And any thoughts on her feeling of enough?
Yes.
Enough in all caps.
It makes sense, right? Her particular story is fascinating because she is so well known, and I think almost exceptional. Most well-known widows seem to take on this spotlight, and it's hard to tell whether they really, some of them clearly really, really, really want to. Some of them you almost wonder if it's, what else are they going to do? They're stuck, or you have all of these veterans who come up to them and who are identifying them as, the widow of their fallen officer or that sort of thing. The person that I always think about in this category of kind of elite widow, who I think is also fascinating, is Emily Todd Helm. So Mary Todd Lincoln's little sister, right? So most of you are probably familiar, but the Helms, Mary's family is huge, and half of them side with the Confederacy and half of them side with the Union. So when Lincoln talks about this being a war of brother versus brother, he's literally talking about his in-laws, right? He is living this kind of fight. And Emily is one of Mary's little sisters that he had adored. He called her little sister. There's this charming story about when they met before the war, because Mary is much older than Emily, where she describes meeting Lincoln and thinking of him as fee, fi, fo, fum, this giant who's marched in, and she hid in her mother's skirts. And so there's this very affectionate kind of family relationship that is broken when her husband fights for the Confederacy, and then he is killed in Georgia, and she was in Georgia traveling with him at the time. And she is someone, there's this complicated story where she actually is in the White House for a little bit. She causes all of these problems because she's a Todd and she doesn't shut her mouth. And so she's in the United States White House, and yet she's still talking about Confederates and Union soldiers running like scared rabbits and all of this. And anyway, after the war, she is exactly what the Confederacy wants to be. So it's the opposite example of the example in our question in our chat here. She is going to go to Veterans Association meetings. They are going to put her picture on the badges that they wear. They're going to call her the mother of the Orphan Brigade, or husband's regiment, because they're from Kentucky, right? So they're the Orphan Brigade because Kentucky never seceded and all of this. And she will do this, and she will outlive Mary, and then she'll try to kind of repair that storyline, and she'll outlive the majority of the Todd family, who are disastrous in all sorts of ways, and tries to kind of lie and manipulate and maneuver and make her family into what she wants it to be. And on the day that she died, this is neither here nor there, I'm way off track now, but on the day that she died, her daughter finds her, her granddaughter finds her in the backyard burning all of these letters, all of these diaries, says there's too much bitterness that she doesn't want out there. And I think that's fascinating for a woman who's devoted herself to trying to build up this history. She doesn't want it to be her history. She wants to be the history that she has maneuvered. Anyway, she's a woman with the time, the ability, and the capital to play this role on the stages. But there certainly are some examples of those who say, no, enough, time to move on.
And we'll go on to Emily's question. She says, what percentage of widows married older men or veterans with war wounds?
Great question. I don't have the numbers. That I would love to have those numbers. There certainly were more age gaps. I remember reading through several examples of widows who are much older than their second husbands. One was particularly striking because he or she had lived this whole life. She was still young as a widow, lived this whole kind of life experience. And her second husband had been in Europe, in college, at school. And I'm thinking, how did this work, right? He missed something that was so pivotal to her life. And then there was about a 5 or 6 year age gap there. As far as those who had maybe lost a limb or something like that, I'm sure that it happened. I think one of the most fascinating examples of this is if you type in like, oldest Confederate widow or something on those lines, once you get past the book, there was a woman in Alabama who, when she was in her teens, married a Confederate veteran who was in his 80s, very, very poor family. And she said, better to be a young man's darling than an old man's slave and all of those kinds of things. And there's like a 50+ year age gap. So she got the distinction of being the oldest Confederate widow. She's in the Confederates in the Attic book, if you're familiar with that one, right? So it gets the distinction of being the oldest Confederate widow because of this age gap between them. So she lives until the 1990s and gets carried around to various Civil War events and things because of that connection. So that would be the biggest age gap. I think as far as the remarriages that I did study, even though I don't have percentages, in the Civil War era, it would be about plus or minus 5 or 6 years in either direction. I didn't see huge age gaps during that time. And it seems like most women who wanted to remarry were able to, for the most part, as far as examples that I found. So great question.
It's always struck me as very interesting, the age gap between Hetty Carey and her second husband, and that she was quite a bit older than he was. So I don't know why I was thinking that, but I just I don't know, maybe you know this. Is there a picture of her when she is an older woman?
I don't know.
Because I've only seen the young pictures of Hetty Carey, and I think about that age gap because I think it was over 10 years, I think. And I just wonder, she must have really been great looking, even as she got older. But I guess that's kind of an aside as well. And I think we've got one more question. Do you know how long before Confederate widows were granted pensions?
Ooh, yes. So a lot of this is done state by state. So great question, because while Union widows, the widows of the United States, get pensions after the Civil War more quickly, Confederate widows don't, right? Their husbands were not on the winning side of this war, and so they don't. So pensions in community, so that's why community support is so important, I should start by saying. And informally, a lot of that support comes from communities if they're able to at first. And then at the state level, we start to see some pensions coming through in the southern states because the United States is not providing it. I want to say it's in the 1900s. I'm not exactly sure. I didn't use pensions as much in my research simply because it was a needle in a haystack. Because by the time Confederate widows could get a pension, their husband didn't have to die during the Civil War, which was the focus of my research, right? So he just had to fight in the Civil War, and then he might have, have passed away afterwards, and that woman would have been eligible for a pension. For my purposes, I would be reading through dozens and dozens of pensions of husbands who had survived the Civil War, and it was a very needle in a haystack experience. So I used pensions a little bit when I knew it was a widow whose husband had died in the Civil War, and then later would pull that pension application if I could. But yes, yeah, I'm not exactly sure later.
That makes sense. And there is one last question. If you can talk a little bit about the parallels between the grieving process, both public and private, between widows in the North and in the South.
Absolutely. So there are so many dynamics here, and I wish I could have covered all of it. It's so broad between Confederate widows, Union widows, and then I think Black Union widows too. There's some really exciting work that's getting done on that right now as another layer of this experience. So many of the mourning expectations are the same. Mourn for 2.5 years, to wear black, to be religious, right? To focus on the child as the legacy of the late husband. All of that is consistent from what I can tell between the Union and the Confederacy. A lot of the differences that I see are in that for most Union widows, right, unless they're in Gettysburg or something along those lines, the war is not happening in their backyard. They don't have that fear and that trauma of armies and fighting happening right there. They don't have the blockade shortages. Of course, there are certainly some real hardships that happen within the northern states, of course, but in certain areas for the Confederacy, it's the widowhood plus. So not having the husband, not having financial support, not having food, not having, all of that seems to compound a lot of the emotion and make it even stronger for the Confederate widows compared to some of the Union letters that I read. And then the big thing is just that after the Civil War, that yes, Union widows lose a husband, traumatic, terrible, but they win a war, right? So the sacrifice is worth it. They have something they can cling to emotionally, physically, all of that. And then pensions kick in sooner. But for Confederate widows, that seems to be a big difference. And again, as I mentioned, why I was interested in this project is being, how do you wrestle with this and this idea that some of them openly say, like, my sacrifice is meant for nothing, right? What they thought they were fighting for, they were not successful in keeping. So.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Great talk. Thank you to our virtual audience out there. It's good to see so many of our regulars tonight. And yes, don't forget about buying the book. So you can go to the UNC Press website and get that nice, really nice discount. I believe we have the book in our shop as well. So I will mention that. And I will also just mention that it is through the support of our viewers and our members and our donors that we're able to do programming that we do. And so I encourage you, if you're not a member of the American Civil War Museum, to think about becoming a member, and you can find information about that on our website. But thank you all. Again, so sorry for those technical difficulties. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's never a fun thing. But I'm glad that that you were able to get that link and join us. And thank you so much, Angela. And we'll look forward to that next project in a few years. All right. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you.